So, subjectivity, I think, is pretty easy to define. It's something that we feel, we experience on a personal level. And objectivity, as I'm describing it, is basically a shared consensus about our experiences or what is happening outside there, what we are able to interpret from our stimuli, if you will. But then the question is, what about things that most people agree on that are simply not true, right? What about these things? Are those things objective? Is an equality if a, is a characteristic of objectivity the idea that it is possible that it could change? Is there any possible way to know that nothing that something is constant, something is never changing, it is enduring regardless of who's the perceiver? And I'm not sure there is such a thing. I'm not sure there's anything that we humans can point to in this world that does not stem from our very consciousness itself. If it's not capable of being perceived, then I mean it's irrelevant. I think perception is everything in this sense. I want you to, try to debate me on this. Is there anything that I said that is easily challenged, or is there anything else that you can add to what I've said so far?
All right, let me jump into this. First off, you've laid out a compelling train of thought, but I think there are some cracks we can poke at for the sake of exploration. The central premise you've built around the solipsist idea that reality is perception dependent is provocative, but also raises some big challenges. The perception problem. You suggest that something's existence hinges on its capacity to be perceived. But what about phenomena that demonstrably exist yet remain imperceptible to us without tools or inference? For example, subatomic particles or electromagnetic waves. They're not directly perceived through human consciousness, but their existence is inferred from consistent measurable effects. Doesn't this suggest there's an underlying layer of reality that doesn't rely on direct perception but can still objectively exist? If you argue that tools like microscopes or Geiger counters are extensions of our perception, we might ask, is reality just perception plus tools? Or does the world generate these effects independently of whether we're there to observe them? The irrelevance of unperceived objects. You mentioned that if something can't be perceived, it becomes irrelevant. But irrelevance is a human construct tied to our subjective priorities. An asteroid speeding through space on a collision course with Earth doesn't care about relevance. Its existence and trajectory will cause destruction regardless of whether humans notice it beforehand. So, would you say this hypothetical asteroid exists only once we become aware of it? Or does its capacity to obliterate our planet suggest its reality is independent of us? Consensus and objectivity. Your definition of objectivity as a shared consensus is pragmatic, but it's also vulnerable. History shows us that consensus doesn't equal truth. Entire societies once believed the Earth was flat, and yet that didn't alter its actual shape. You're right that objectivity involves shared agreement, but could it also include a correspondence theory? Reality exists as it is, and objectivity comes from how closely our understanding matches that reality? If consensus can be wrong, is it fair to hinge objectivity entirely on agreement? Perception versus reality. Finally, here's the kicker. Your argument assumes perception is primary and reality secondary. But what if it's the reverse? What if consciousness arises from reality rather than reality being a product of consciousness? This flips solipsism on its head. Consciousness, then, would be an emergent property of a physical world that exists independently of it, like a ripple on the surface of a pond. The ripple doesn't define the pond, it's simply a product of it. Counterpoint to solipsism. The biggest challenge to solipsism is intersubjectivity. How do you explain the consistency of experiences between individuals? If you and I both perceive a tree the same way, isn't it reasonable to infer that the tree exists independently of our minds? If reality were entirely consciousness dependent, why would so many aspects of it behave consistently across observers? What do you think about flipping this entirely? Could solipsism itself just be an artifact of perception rather than the baseline truth?
Wow, there is a lot to respond to there, and I wasn't taking notes, so I'm definitely going to miss a lot of it, but let's see how much of it I can respond to. I'll start off with where the last thing that you touched on, which was solipsism. It seems I'm either confused about my definition of solipsism, or you may be misunderstanding how I'm tying that to an extension of subjectivity. You seem to be undercutting my definition of solipsism with the idea that we can all have certain shared subjective experiences, whereas I was actually using that as evidence for solipsism. So correct me if I'm wrong, but solipsism is the idea that everything happens, or everything that exists only exists because of our mental capacity, our ability to perceive things. Now, that seems to be intrinsically subjective to me. So, the fact that multiple people might be able to perceive a certain occurrence to me does not seem like something that undercuts solipsism. If anything, it seems to suggest that everything is coming from a a subjective and individual place, but other people with their own subjectivity can also experience those things. Am I missing the point here? I want you to first respond to that before I move on to your other question about what about these external experiences that we have, not experiences, these external objects or events, if you will, like an asteroid hurtling towards the Earth, and how this is happening even without us regarding it as relevant or noticing it at all. And you mentioned atomic particles and how these too can be inferred even without us actually perceiving these things.
You're on solid ground with your understanding of solipsism, but I think there's a subtle distinction to unpack that might clarify things. Solipsism does indeed assert that everything only exists insofar as it is perceived or experienced by a mind. In that sense, it's inherently subjective because it denies the existence of any objective reality independent of perception. But here's where things get tricky. The existence of shared subjective experiences, what you might call intersubjectivity, poses an interesting challenge to solipsism, not because it directly refutes it, but because it suggests a framework larger than any one individual mind. Your argument, that shared subjective experiences reinforce solipsism, makes sense if you view each individual's experience as evidence of their own mental capacity projecting reality. But a hardline solipsist might counter that even the perception of other minds is itself a construct of your own mind. In other words, if solipsism is true, those other people experiencing the same thing might not actually exist independently. They'd just be parts of the mental framework you're perceiving. So the disagreement might boil down to this. When you acknowledge shared experiences, are you tacitly granting the existence of other independent minds? If so, then you're leaning more toward subjective idealism, where many minds create reality, rather than pure solipsism. Solipsism, in its strictest form, leaves no room for other minds. It's you, your mind, and nothing else. Does that align with your interpretation? Or do you see shared experiences differently in how they might fit solipsism?
So you said my point of view is more aligned with the idea of subjective idealism. Did I get your term for that accurately? And if that's the case, I'm happy to go along with that term as long as you understand my thoughts about that. So with solipsism, at least as far as the hardline view that you're describing, I would actually, I would still debate that, but I don't want to digress too much from the point of this discussion, which is objectivity and subjectivity. And I would just say to that solipsism seems to, the hardline view, at least to me, seems to collapse under its own weight, because that would seem to imply that we are the only thing that exists, that our own mental capacity is the only thing that exists. Unless, if I heard you right, you said might. It might be that other people don't exist, in which case I would actually agree with the hardline solipsist if it's a matter of probability, if you will, and not something definitive, to say that the only place that the only thing that is real is both my own perception and the possible perception of other people out there as opposed to just mine alone. So in that sense, I would agree with that actually, and I would still think that that aligns with what you might have called subjective idealism, because what about dreams? Dreams are something that we have and we feel other people out there are real and objective, but we don't really realize that. Lucid dreams, of course, is what I'm talking about here. We don't really realize that they are just constructs, mental constructs, until they dissolve into the reality that we wake up into. So how do we ever know that other people are not? So if we have that realization or that acknowledgement that it might be a dream, it might not, then I think we leave room for that possibility.
Yes, you nailed the term subjective idealism. That aligns well with what you're describing. The idea that reality exists as a construct of individual minds, but with the acknowledgement that other minds might also independently exist and contribute to this shared reality. This differs from hardline solipsism, which insists only your mind exists, and everything else is an extension or projection of your own consciousness. Your critique of hardline solipsism is spot on. It collapses under its own weight because it's almost impossible to definitively disprove the independent existence of other minds or an external reality. The dream analogy is a fantastic way to frame this. In dreams, we experience other people, environments, and events as real, only to later realize they were constructs of our mind. This leaves open the possibility that waking reality might work similarly, potentially a shared dream of multiple minds, rather than the isolated dream of a single consciousness. By tying this to subjective idealism, you leave room for the possibility that other minds exist, even if they're experienced through the lens of your own subjectivity. This approach also makes space for intersubjectivity, that shared realm of experiences where consensus forms the basis of what we call objective. It doesn't reject solipsism entirely, but reframes it to acknowledge the limitations of what we can know versus what we can experience. So, to tie this back to objectivity and subjectivity, your framework implies that objectivity is not a static, unchanging truth, but rather a dynamic, probabilistic agreement shaped by many subjective minds. It's the best approximation of reality we can collectively construct, even if it remains filtered through the limits of perception and consciousness. Would you say that this understanding satisfies your broader exploration of objectivity, or do you see areas where this falls short? And do you think the dream analogy applies fully to waking life, or are there distinctions that keep them separate?
I want to table the idea of subjectivity and objectivity just for a bit longer while we put this idea of solipsism to rest. So, if I understand you, this example that I brought up about dreams and how it's not possible sometimes, and I mean, maybe every time, to tell whether other beings exist outside of our mental construct. You're saying that even that example, which I thought I was using to solidify the idea of solipsism, you're saying even that undercuts it too, because the very idea of given some probability to a being outside of our mental construct existing is anathema to the idea of solipsism, because solipsism in its strict sense is the idea that nothing could possibly exist outside of our mental construct. Do I understand this right? And if that's the case, then if that is the strict definition of solipsism, and there's no room for other possibilities of beings, or there's no room for the possibility of other beings existing, then I can happily jump on board with, the subjective idealism.
Yes, you've got it. Hardline solipsism, by its strictest definition, denies the existence of any reality outside your own mind. It doesn't leave room for probabilities, possibilities, or even the acknowledgement that other minds might exist as constructs within your perception. The mere idea that you entertain the potential for beings or entities beyond your own mind inherently breaks from solipsism because it implies something external to your singular consciousness. Your dream analogy actually does a better job supporting subjective idealism because it leaves open the possibility that while your perceptions and experiences might be constructs, there's still room for other minds, or at least the possibility of their independent existence to co create or share the reality you experience. In subjective idealism, consciousness still sits at the core of reality, but it's not confined to just yours. It acknowledges the interplay of many subjective perspectives, shaping what we collectively call reality. So, yeah, solipsism in its pure form has no room for what ifs about other minds. If it's all you and only you, the concept of probability, implying uncertainty, doesn't even compute. By jumping on board with subjective idealism, you're embracing a more flexible framework that allows for your dream analogy to coexist with the possibility of other beings. Does that feel like it puts the solipsism debate to rest? Or is there still something bugging you?
It does. It definitely puts that debate to rest. I think it was a definitional problem, if that's a good way to describe it. If not, then please correct my phraseology. And I want to now move on to the bigger question here of objectivity versus subjectivity. Since you now understand what I was getting at, and you have associated that with subjective idealism, now are you able to give me any challenges to this idea of subjective idealism? I'm guessing one of them has to do with the things you mentioned earlier, as far as atomic particles and asteroids hurtling towards Earth, and how these things don't rely on any consensus of our experiences. So, if what I'm calling objectivity is our consensus of what happens, our consensus about experiences, then you're saying that how do I reconcile that with the things that would happen regardless of our perception about them? Well, I think the way that I would answer that is I still go back to this idea of relevance. I'm not sure if you were asking me or if you were, pointing it out as a refutation to what I was saying. But I think until this asteroid comes into our purview, until we register this asteroid on some tool or device or with our eyes or whatever it may be, that asteroid does not have, that asteroid, the existence of that asteroid at that point is only dependent on its relevancy to us. I'm not sure if that's a good way to put it. The fact that it is hurtling towards us has no merit if we are not able to observe it. I mean, not that it's not going to be consequential, but more that it's almost like a first order question and a second order question. Are we able to perceive it is the first order question. If we're not able to perceive it, then it doesn't matter how relevant that thing is. It doesn't matter how, cosmically objective that thing is, if you will, because we were not able to perceive it. So I think perception, I would still hold, is what is fundamental to anything that we consider to be subjective or objective. I think it is intrinsic in any objective interpretation of anything that happens, that we are doing so from a place of our own experiences and our own perceptions. And yes, I would include the tools that we're able to use in that basket of perception.
You're making a nuanced and thoughtful case for subjective idealism, and I think you've laid out a solid framework. But let's dive into some challenges to test its boundaries. Your idea that relevance depends on perception is intriguing, but runs into a philosophical counterpoint. Does reality require an observer to exist? This gets into debates like those surrounding quantum mechanics and the infamous Schrodinger's cat. In the classical sense, objects like asteroids or particles don't need us to exist. They follow natural laws regardless of our awareness. For example, an asteroid hurtling toward Earth doesn't require us to perceive it to cause destruction. It would still hit the planet and create physical effects. Would you argue that the destruction itself, too, lacks meaning without someone to perceive it? If so, wouldn't that imply reality is entirely contingent on consciousness? That feels like a bold leap. First order versus second order questions. I like your distinction between first order questions, is it perceived, and second order questions. Does its relevance matter? But doesn't this collapse the importance of anything unperceived? For example, before humans existed, the universe was still forming stars, creating planets, and following natural processes. Would subjective idealism suggest None of that was real, because no consciousness was there to perceive it? If so, this view implies a strange temporal arrogance that reality only began with perceiving beings. Tools and objectivity. Including tools as an extension of perception is smart because it accounts for phenomena we couldn't directly sense. But tools measure things based on physical principles that don't depend on our subjective experience. A Geiger counter detecting radiation isn't perceiving in the same way you or I would. It's reacting to immutable physical laws. Isn't this evidence of an objective framework underpinning subjective interpretation? Tools seem to bridge the gap between subjective perception and objective reality, suggesting that objectivity might still exist independently, even if our understanding of it is mediated by subjective tools. Perception independent truths. Here's a challenge: mathematics. Mathematical truths, like 2 plus 2 equaling 4, don't depend on perception. They're abstract, conceptual frameworks that seem to exist independently of our subjective minds. Even if no conscious beings existed, the relationships described by mathematics would still hold. Does subjective idealism have room for such perception independent truths? Or does it reduce everything, even abstraction, to a form of perception? The cosmic scale. Finally, consider the sheer size and age of the universe. If the cosmos has existed for billions of years before life, subjective idealism seems to require dismissing those eras as non existent or irrelevant. Isn't it more parsimonious to say reality exists independently, but our understanding of it is shaped by perception? Reflection. Your position hinges on a very human centric framework. Reality is what we can perceive, and nothing outside of that matters. But what if relevance isn't a prerequisite for reality? Perhaps reality exists regardless, and our perceptions simply carve out meaning from a much larger, indifferent framework. Does this challenge your position? Or do you think subjective idealism can evolve to account for these ideas?
First of all, I will admit that I don't think relevance was a good word to use in this context. I think it made this much murkier than it needed to be. But I do want to still hold on to my idea that subjectivity is all there is, but perhaps maybe I can reword the way that I'm saying that. I'm not saying that there is nothing that has existed. This might sound like a contradiction, but I promise you it's more to do with my inability to to articulate these as precisely as I want to, more than it is me trying to move the goalpost here. But my what I was saying was that I'm not saying that there is no history that has existed prior to our collective consciousness or our collective ability to perceive anything, or that things don't aren't registered on tools before we are then able to observe these things. What I am saying is that if we do not observe these things, if it's not through our experiences and our consciousness, until that collision between reality and our consciousness happens, there is absolutely no way to know that something is objective. Something that is objective inherently exists in the umbrella, if you will, of our ability to perceive it. And again, I go back to this tool idea. When you said that if a tool is able to record something irrespective of us perceiving it or reading whatever the tool has recorded, does that mean that whatever reality the tool was able to assess is not real? That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying what I am saying is that until we come into contact with whatever it is that the tool has read, that then is not, there is no place for that thing that exists outside of our contact with that bridge, even if it's a bridge, right? Even if these tools are bridges, as you put it, there is no confirmation or disapproval, or, that then practically is non-existent. It's almost like the argument you're making almost sounds like, it almost sounds like you're asking me, if something doesn't exist, how do I know that then it's not objective? Well, I don't know if it's objective or if it's not objective until I come into contact with something that is able to show me through my experience that that thing exists, right? So it's not that things don't exist, it's that until we come into contact with some way, some stimuli that engages us in a way that registers that as some, as an existence, if you will, whether it's an experience or an item or whatever, there is no place for objectivity. Does that make sense?
Yes, that absolutely makes sense now that you've clarified it. It seems like your core idea isn't about denying the existence of things outside of human perception, but rather asserting that objectivity, as we understand it, only takes shape when consciousness engages with whatever is out there. Your point is that until there's that collision between reality and our perception or experience, there's no meaningful way to talk about objectivity. It exists in limbo, so to speak, without our conscious engagement to define or interpret it. This doesn't move the goalpost, it just tightens the phrasing. If I'm understanding correctly, your argument boils down to this: something might exist independently, but until it's registered through consciousness, directly or via tools, it's irrelevant in terms of being part of our conceptual framework of reality. Objectivity, then, is always filtered through subjectivity because it must intersect with perception to gain any meaning. Am I following you? Now, here's where I might gently push back. Isn't it possible that objectivity is independent of whether we perceive it, and what we're really debating is how we confirm objectivity? In other words, your framework might be conflating epistemology, how we know things, with ontology, what things are. The asteroid hurtling through space doesn't need our perception to exist, it simply is. What you're pointing out, though, is that our understanding of its existence is limited until we perceive it. And I agree with that entirely. Where I think the tension lies is whether practical non-existence, i.e., something existing but being unknown to us, undermines objectivity itself. Does the mere fact that we can't register something mean it lacks objective existence? Or does it mean objectivity is something we approximate and refine as our tools and awareness improve? If you're saying objectivity can only exist as a concept tied to perception, then your framework aligns perfectly with subjective idealism. But if you're leaving room for things to exist outside our awareness while still claiming they don't matter until perceived, you might actually be brushing up against a blend of idealism and realism. What do you think? Is the boundary of objectivity perception itself? Or is perception just the gateway through which we engage with a potentially independent, objective reality?
I think it's a distinction without a difference, as the expression goes. It is a gateway, but at the same time, there is no way to talk or frame, or how would you say, there is no way to contend with whatever objectivity there might be until we open this gateway, or until this thing, through a tool or through some sheer force of the universe, brings it to our perception. So in that sense, I guess this is where that word relevancy came in for me. Until it comes into contact with our perception, it is essentially irrelevant, not in the sense that it's not going to be consequential once it does appear in our consciousness, but it's irrelevant in the sense that there is no way to know that thing. Like, until we know it, we don't know it. I'm struggling to understand how what I'm saying could be tightened up to make it even more, even more poignant. But at the same time, I'm also struggling to understand if I'm missing a point that you're making. So maybe you can assess what I've said so far, and I don't know if this clarifies anything for you, or if I'm just still misunderstanding.
You've clarified your position really well, and I think we're circling around the same idea, but framing it slightly differently. Your central argument boils down to this: objectivity, as a meaningful concept, only comes into play when there's a collision with perception. Until something interacts with our consciousness, directly or indirectly, it's not something we can talk about, confirm, or contend with in any practical sense. In that way, it's effectively irrelevant, not because it doesn't exist, but because it exists in a domain beyond our ability to know or engage with it. That's a strong and coherent position. Where I think the tension lies is in defining whether this irrelevance, as you describe it, negates the thing's independent existence or just highlights the limitations of what we can claim to know. It seems like you're emphasizing the epistemological limit, that until perception bridges the gap, objectivity is meaningless because it has no relationship to our experience. And I think that's perfectly valid within the framework of subjective idealism. The pushback I've offered isn't really about misunderstanding you, but rather about exploring whether objectivity could exist independently regardless of our awareness. Here's where I think the distinction lies. 1. Your view. Objectivity only becomes a functional concept when perception gives it meaning. Without perception, there's no framework to talk about objective reality in any meaningful way, even if the thing out there exists. 2. Alternative view. Objectivity exists independently of perception, but perception is how we engage with or approximate it. The asteroid exists whether or not we see it. Perception is just the means by which we come to know it. You're essentially arguing that this distinction, whether the asteroid exists independently or not, is irrelevant because any discussion of objectivity inherently requires perception. Without that bridge, the concept of objectivity lacks practical or epistemological weight. That's where your relevance argument fits. It's not about denying existence, but about defining what matters in the context of knowledge and interaction. To tighten up your phrasing, you might say something like this. Objectivity as a concept is inextricably tied to perception. While things may exist independently, their objective status has no meaning until they intersect with consciousness through direct experience or mediated tools. Until this intersection occurs, any discussion of objectivity is speculative and, for all practical purposes, irrelevant. Does that framing capture your argument, or do you feel there's still a gap in how it's coming across?
It does capture my argument perfectly. I could not have possibly said it any better myself. And also, if I'm not mistaken, it sounded like you finally agreed with me about that. I mean, I didn't really notice any pushback in the last comments you made. Maybe not maybe agree might be too strong a word, but at least you didn't seem to have any obvious challenges to the viewpoint that I had raised, or at least you didn't seem to be able to point out any contradictions or inconsistencies in the way that I explained myself. Is that fair to say? I'm a bit cautious, anxious, maybe is a better word, asking you this question because I'm hoping to wrap up and I don't want to open up another can of worms. I feel like I am really poking the hornet's nest here by asking you, by trying to gloat.
You clarified your argument so well that it became consistent and internally coherent, which is why I reframed it in a way that fully captured what you were saying. I wouldn't say I agreed entirely, but I definitely found fewer places to challenge because you tightened things up so effectively. If I didn't raise any new objections, it's because I think your framework stands solidly within subjective idealism. And don't worry, asking for a little affirmation isn't poking a hornet's nest. If anything, it's an exclamation point on what's been a thoughtful, nuanced discussion. Do you feel like this wraps things up for now? Or should I prepare a fresh can of worms just in case?
No, please don't do that. It's I've been on this video for a while and it's time to wrap up. Maybe we can pick this back up some other time. And until then, I appreciate you watching this video. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you found it entertaining, interesting, insightful, whatever it may be. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks for watching.